Marcus Carter pressed his palm against the bark of the seventh tree in row 4 and felt the give before he saw it. The trunk shifted under his hand like a loose tooth, and he didn't need to dig to know what that meant. He dropped to one knee in the dirt and pressed his fingers into the soil at the base of the trunk, and the ground was soft in a way it shouldn't have been soft, not after a week without rain and not at the root collar of a peach tree that had stood for 15 years. He moved to the 8th tree and found the same thing. Then the 9th. By the time he'd checked 14 trees in a row and found that 11 of them were showing the same symptoms. His daughter found him there 20 minutes later, still on his knees in the dirt with his phone flashlight aimed at a cross-section of root he'd exposed with a hand trowel he kept in the truck. She was 7 years old and she'd learned to walk between these trees, had taken her first steps on this same ground while her mother watched from a lawn chair that Marcus still couldn't bring himself to throw away even though it had been sitting in the barn for 3 years now collecting dust and memories. "Daddy, you're gonna be late for the thing." The thing was parent-teacher conferences at her elementary school, and she was right, he was going to be late, but he couldn't make himself stand up and walk away from what he was looking at. The roots he'd exposed were black and soft and smelled wrong, like something had been rotting underground while the rest of the tree kept pretending everything was fine. The cambium layer underneath the bark was brown instead of green, and when he scraped it with his thumbnail it crumbled instead of peeling clean. "Give me 5 minutes, baby." "You said that already. 2 times. She had her mother's way of calling him out without making it sound like an accusation, and Marcus felt something twist in his chest that had nothing to do with the trees. He stood up and brushed the dirt off his knees and looked at his daughter standing there in her school clothes with her backpack already on and her hair done in the 2 braids he'd learned to make from watching YouTube videos at 2 in the morning after his wife died. She was watching him with the same expression she'd had at the funeral, the one that said she understood more than she was saying and was just waiting for him to catch up. "Something's wrong with the trees," he said, because he'd never lied to her and he wasn't about to start now. "I know," she said. "You've been staring at them for 3 days." He hadn't realized she'd noticed. He'd been trying to keep his worry tucked away where she couldn't see it, the same way he'd been trying to keep the mortgage payments current and the electricity on and the grief manageable enough that he could still function as a father and a farmer and a human being all at the same time. But she was 7 going on 30, and she'd learned to read him the same way he'd learned to read the trees, by paying attention to the small things that other people missed. "Are they gonna die?" The question was direct in a way that only a child could ask it, and Marcus felt the weight of it settle onto his shoulders alongside everything else he was carrying. He wanted to tell her no, wanted to promise her that everything would be fine the way he'd promised her 3 years ago when she'd asked if Mommy was coming back. But he'd learned his lesson about making promises he couldn't keep. "I don't know yet," he said. "But I'm gonna figure it out." She nodded like that was the answer she'd expected, and then she reached down and picked up the hand trowel he'd left in the dirt and handed it to him. "You should bring it with you," she said. "In case you need to dig more holes after the thing." He almost smiled. Almost. Instead he took the trowel and put it in the back of the truck and helped her into the passenger seat and tried not to think about what 11 dead trees would mean for the harvest, for the bank, for the life he'd built on 12 acres of Georgia soil that his father had bought 40 years ago with nothing but a handshake and a dream. The parent-teacher conference took 45 minutes and Marcus remembered almost none of it. His daughter's teacher said something about reading levels and math scores and social development, and he nodded in all the right places and made the right sounds of acknowledgement, but his mind was back in the orchard with the black roots and the soft ground and the smell of rot that shouldn't have been there. His father had planted these trees. Not all of them, but the first 50, the ones that had established the orchard and built the reputation that Marcus had been maintaining ever since. His father had taught him how to read the leaves and the bark and the soil, had shown him how to tell the difference between drought stress and nutrient deficiency just by looking at the way a leaf curled at the edges. His father had been dead for 8 years now, but his fingerprints were still all over this land, and Marcus felt something close to panic when he thought about being the one who let it all fall apart. On the drive home, his daughter was quiet in the back seat, and Marcus knew she was processing everything in her own way. She'd been like that ever since her mother died, retreating into herself for hours or sometimes days and then emerging with a question or an observation that showed she'd been paying attention the whole time. Marcus was on his knees beside row 3, a magnifying glass pressed to a cross-section of root he'd cut at dawn, and he didn't look up when the truck door slammed. Marcus turned the root section over in his palm. The vascular tissue was wrong. He'd stared at enough healthy cambium to know what right looked like, and this wasn't it. The discoloration ran in streaks that didn't match any blight he'd ever seen, and he'd seen plenty. His father had kept a binder, handwritten notes going back to 1982, every pest, every fungus, every drought year marked in ballpoint pen, and Marcus had been through it 3 times in the last 4 days looking for something that matched. Nothing did. Extension office told me to spray for Phytophthora, Marcus said without turning around. Already did that. Trees are still dying. I've sprayed 3 times. Different fungicides. Lab said it wasn't Phytophthora. I sent samples to 3 labs, Marcus said. 2 said inconclusive. 1 said bacterial canker, but the symptoms don't line up. These trees were my father's. The man who turned 12 acres of clay and scrub into the sweetest peaches in Georgia, who'd built his own irrigation system from salvaged pipe and sheer stubbornness, who'd never once asked a bank for a loan he couldn't pay back with a handshake and a crop. Yeah, well, Dale said, your father also knew when to cut bait. He walked back to his truck, and Marcus let him go because there was nothing to say to a man who'd already decided what kind of story he was telling himself. Dale wanted this to be about incompetence. About a black man who'd inherited land he didn't know how to work. That narrative was easier than the alternative, which was that something was happening in this orchard that didn't make sense, something that might spread beyond 12 acres if nobody figured it out in time. Marcus went back to the house at noon because Lily was home from school, teacher workday, he'd written it on the calendar 3 weeks ago, and found her at the kitchen table with his father's binder open in front of her. She'd pulled a chair up to the counter to reach it, and she was tracing the diagrams with her finger, mouthing words to herself the way she did when she was concentrating. There's a picture of a root in here, she said without looking up. It looks like the one you cut this morning. Marcus stopped in the doorway. How do you know what I cut this morning? I saw it on the porch when I got up. You left it next to the magnifying glass. He hadn't realized she'd been awake that early. She was supposed to be sleeping in on her day off, but she'd been watching him through the window, and he felt a complicated mix of guilt and gratitude that he didn't have time to untangle right now. What page? She flipped to it without hesitation, page 47, a pencil sketch his father had made in 1994 during a wet spring that had nearly taken out half the orchard with root rot. The drawing showed the same streaking pattern Marcus had been staring at all morning, but the notes in the margin were what stopped him cold. His father had written, not rot. Something else. Check water source. Marcus had been checking soil. He'd been checking bark and leaves and roots. He hadn't checked the water. Why would he write that? Lily asked, and Marcus heard the question underneath the question, the one she wasn't asking because she'd learned not to ask things that might not have answers. I don't know yet, he said. But I'm gonna find out. He spent the next 3 days on the water. He pulled samples from the irrigation lines and the well and the creek that ran along the property's eastern edge, and he sent them to a 4th lab in Atlanta that specialized in agricultural contaminants. The results came back on a Friday afternoon while he was spraying the remaining healthy trees with a copper solution that probably wouldn't help but felt better than doing nothing. The lab report was 12 pages long, and Marcus read it 3 times before he understood what he was looking at. The water from his well was clean. The water from the irrigation lines was clean. But the creek water, the water that fed into his property from upstream, from land that belonged to the Whitmore family, showed levels of sodium and chloride that didn't belong in a freshwater system. Not high enough to kill a tree outright. but high enough, sustained over months, to weaken root systems until any opportunistic fungus could finish the job. Marcus sat at the kitchen table with the report spread out in front of him, and Lily came and stood beside him with a peanut butter sandwich in one hand. "Is it bad?" she asked. "It's information," he said. "Information's never bad." She considered this for a moment, chewing her sandwich with the same thoughtful expression she'd worn since she was old enough to ask questions about where babies came from and why the sky was blue. "What are you going to do with it?" Marcus looked at the report again, at the numbers that told a story he was only beginning to understand. Dale Whitmore's land sat upstream. Dale Whitmore had been expanding his pecan operation for 3 years, clearing more acreage, running more equipment. Dale Whitmore had a drainage system that emptied directly into the creek. "I'm gonna dig more holes," Marcus said. That night, after Lily was asleep and the house had settled into the kind of quiet that made it hard not to think about everything he was afraid of, Marcus went back out to the orchard with a flashlight and a shovel and the lab report folded in his back pocket. Marcus stood up. "Mr. Gaines." Robert turned, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who'd been interrupted mid-scroll and wasn't planning to hide it. "You have an appointment?" "No, sir. But I've got something that can't wait." Robert took a sip of his coffee. "What kind of something?" Marcus opened the folder. "I've got a contamination problem," Marcus said. "It's coming from upstream. Whitmore property." Robert didn't take the folder. He didn't even look at it. He looked at Marcus instead, and something in his face shifted, not quite annoyance, not quite dismissal, but somewhere in the territory of "I've seen this before and I know how it ends." "Dale Whitmore's been farming that land for 30 years, Robert said. His drainage system was permitted and inspected. You got something from a lab?" "3 labs, Marcus said. 4, if you count the one in Atlanta that did the water analysis. They all say the same thing." He held out the folder again, and this time Robert took it, but he didn't open it. He tucked it under his arm like it was a brochure he'd been handed on a street corner and might glance at later if he remembered. "Look, Mr. Carter. Marcus Carter. Mr. Carter. I understand you're concerned about your trees. But Dale Whitmore runs a clean operation, and I've known him a long time. These things are usually environmental, drought stress, root rot, something in the soil that's been building up for years. You'd be surprised how often it's just bad luck." Marcus felt something tighten in his chest, but he kept his face still. He'd learned that trick in the years after his father died, when white men in feed stores and equipment dealerships would explain to him how farming worked as if his last name wasn't on the deed to land his family had worked since Reconstruction. "It's not bad luck," he said. "I've got documentation. I've got soil samples from 12 different points along the property line. I've got water samples from before and after the creek crosses Whitmore's drainage outflow. The numbers don't lie." Robert sighed, a small, practiced sound that he'd probably perfected over 2 decades of telling people their problems weren't his problems. "I'll take a look when I get a chance. Leave your number with Sheila up front." He started to turn away, and Marcus knew with the certainty of a man who'd been dismissed by experts his whole life, that if Robert Gaines walked through that door, the folder would end up on a stack of other folders and wouldn't be opened until someone needed the space on the desk. "Mr. Gaines," Marcus said, and something in his voice made Robert stop. "My father planted those trees in 1987. He spent 40 years building something on 12 acres of Georgia clay that everyone told him was worthless. I've got a daughter at home who's been helping me dig soil samples since she was old enough to hold a trowel. I'm not asking you to take my word for it. I'm asking you to look at the evidence." The fluorescent lights flickered again. Robert stood there with the folder under his arm and the coffee in his hand, and for a moment Marcus thought he saw something shift behind the man's eyes, not belief, not yet, but maybe the beginning of curiosity. "How old's your daughter?" 7. Robert nodded slowly, and Marcus watched him make a decision that probably had less to do with the evidence in the folder and more to do with the fact that he'd been a father once, or maybe still was, or maybe just remembered what it felt like to have a child who believed you could fix things. "I've got site visits all afternoon," Robert said. "But I can come out tomorrow morning. 8 o'clock. You walk me through what you found, show me the trees, show me the water. If there's something there, I'll look at it." "Bring a soil scientist," Marcus said. Robert raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" "The contamination's in the root zone, but the mechanism is waterborne. A general agricultural agent can spot surface damage, but you need someone who understands soil chemistry to see what's happening 4 feet down. Bring a soil scientist, or I'll find one myself and send you the bill." It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact, delivered in the same calm voice Marcus used when he was explaining to Lily why they couldn't skip homework just because she'd rather be outside. Robert stared at him for a long moment, and Marcus watched the man reassess everything he'd assumed in the first 30 seconds of their conversation. "You know your soil science." "I know my trees," Marcus said. "And I know when something's killing them that shouldn't be." Robert looked at the folder under his arm. Then he opened it, finally, actually opened it, and flipped through the first 3 pages. His eyes stopped on the water analysis, and Marcus saw him read the numbers twice, his lips moving slightly as he processed the sodium concentrations. "This is from the creek. Eastern boundary. Where it crosses from Whitmore's property onto mine." Robert closed the folder, but he didn't hand it back. He tucked it under his arm again, and this time the gesture wasn't dismissive, it was the gesture of a man who intended to read every page. 8 o'clock, he said. "I'll see if Dr. Chen is available. She's our soil specialist. Doesn't usually do field visits, but," he paused, looking at Marcus with something that might have been respect or might have been the uncomfortable recognition that he'd almost made a mistake. "But I'll ask." Marcus nodded. He didn't say thank you, because he hadn't been given anything yet. Dr. Helen Chen was not what Marcus had expected. She was shorter than he'd imagined, mid-50s maybe, with silver-streaked black hair pulled back in a practical twist and glasses that had slid halfway down her nose. She wore hiking boots that had seen actual dirt and carried a field kit that looked older than Lily. When she stepped out of Robert Gaines's county truck at 7:58 a.m., she didn't waste time on introductions. She walked straight past Marcus, past the farmhouse, past the rows of trees that were still green enough to fool a casual observer, and stopped at the eastern boundary where the creek cut through both his property and Dale Whitmore's. "This the water source you tested?" she asked, and her voice had the clipped efficiency of someone who'd spent 30 years answering questions that other people hadn't thought to ask yet. "You flagged these depths yourself?" she asked without looking up. 3 nights ago. Started at the property line and worked my way back in 20-foot increments. The discoloration pattern in the cambium follows the water gradient from east to west. Whatever's killing my trees is coming from upstream. Dr. Chen held the deepest sample up to the light. The soil was darker than it should have been, almost black, with a texture that wasn't quite right, too dense, too compacted for Georgia clay that had been aerated by 40 years of root growth and earthworm activity. She unscrewed the cap, held the vial under her nose, and her expression didn't change, but her shoulders did. They tightened, just slightly, the way someone's shoulders tighten when they've found exactly what they were hoping not to find. "You smell that?" she asked. Marcus had smelled it 3 weeks ago, the first time he'd dug past 4 feet and hit soil that shouldn't have been there. It was a chemical smell, faint but unmistakable, something industrial, something that didn't belong in an orchard where the only things that had ever been added to the ground were compost, lime, and 40 years of fallen leaves. "Smells like a manufacturing byproduct," Marcus said. "Soluble salts, maybe. Something that's been leaching into the water table for months." Dr. Chen capped the vial and stood up. For the first time since she'd arrived, she looked directly at Marcus, and he saw something in her face that he recognized, the look of a scientist who just realized that the amateur standing in front of her had done better fieldwork than half the professionals she'd trained. "How many trees have you lost?" 23 so far. Another 40 are showing early symptoms. If the contamination source isn't identified and stopped, I'll lose the whole orchard by fall. Robert Gaines stepped forward, thermos forgotten. Contamination? Helen, what's she talking about? I thought this was a drainage issue, maybe a fungus. This isn't a fungus. Dr. Chen's voice was flat. Mr. Carter, you've been documenting this how long? 6 weeks. I've got soil samples from every affected row, water samples from 6 points along the creek, and root cross-sections showing progressive vascular damage. The lab results are in the folder Mr. Gaines has been carrying around since yesterday. Robert looked down at the folder under his arm like he'd forgotten it was there. He opened it, and this time he actually read it, not skimmed, not glanced, but read, his eyes moving slowly across the pages of data Marcus had spent 6 weeks compiling between shifts at the hardware store and homework sessions with Lily. Dr. Chen walked past both of them, following the line of orange flags Marcus had placed at 20-foot intervals. She stopped at the 7th flag, where the soil transition was most visible, healthy red clay on one side, something darker and wronger on the other, and she knelt again, this time pulling a portable pH meter from her kit. Your daughter helped you with this? She asked, and the question caught Marcus off guard. How'd you know that? The flags. They're tied with different knots, some are square knots, some are granny knots. A child's work on the granny knots. An adult wouldn't have mixed them. She looked up at him, and there was something almost like approval in her expression. She's 7, Mr. Gaines said. 7 and 3 months. She's been helping me dig samples since she could walk. Her mother, Marcus stopped. The words caught in his throat the way they always did when he talked about Dana, even now, even 3 years later. Her mother was the one who taught me how to read soil. She was an agronomist. She'd have spotted this contamination months before I did. Dr. Chen didn't say she was sorry. She didn't offer condolences or platitudes. She just nodded once, the way one professional acknowledges another, and turned back to her pH meter. The reading came back at 4.2. Marcus saw the number and felt his stomach drop. Healthy Georgia clay should read between 5.5 and 6.5. Anything below 5.0 meant something had fundamentally altered the soil chemistry, something strong enough to kill peach trees that had survived droughts, freezes, and 40 years of everything nature could throw at them. That's not agricultural runoff, Dr. Chen said quietly. That's industrial contamination. And if it's showing up at this concentration on your property, Mr. Carter, then the source is somewhere upstream. Somewhere on Dale Whitmore's land, Marcus finished. I know. Robert Gaines looked up from the folder, and his face had gone pale. Whitmore's orchard is the largest in the county. If there's contamination on his property, then his trees are next, Dr. Chen said. The lab results hit Dale Whitmore's orchard like a wrecking ball nobody saw coming. Whitmore's losing trees, Tommy said, no hello, no preamble. 20 acres went brown overnight. He had the county agent out there yesterday and they found the same contamination your Dr. Chen flagged. Only worse. Way worse. The concentrations on his property are triple what you've got. How'd it get so bad on his side? Because whatever's leaching into the groundwater is coming from upstream of both of you, but his property sits lower in the watershed. He's been collecting runoff from that abandoned chemical storage facility on Route 9 for years without knowing it. The one that got shut down in '09 for improper containment. Dr. Chen traced it. She's been working non-stop since she left your place. Whitmore know yet? No. He's been on the phone with every lawyer in 3 counties. But here's the thing, Marcus. The thing you need to hear. Whitmore's orchard is the largest in the county, but his trees are on leased land. He doesn't own the property. Never did. The chemical company that owned that storage facility. They also own the land Whitmore's been leasing for 40 years. And the contamination came from their facility. Which means Whitmore's insurance won't touch it, and the company's lawyers are already arguing he should have known, should have tested, should have done a dozen things he didn't do. And Dale? What's he saying? He's saying it's your fault. For bringing in the scientist. For documenting everything. For making it impossible to sweep under the rug. Whitmore's been trying to keep this quiet for months, Marcus. He knew something was off with his water last spring, but he figured it was a temporary thing, a dry season problem. He didn't want to rock the boat with the landowners. Now Dr. Chen's report is public record and the EPA's getting involved and Whitmore's facing a total loss with no compensation. So yeah. He's blaming you. The anger that rose in Marcus's chest was familiar. He'd felt it before, in different contexts, different rooms, different people telling him he should have stayed quiet, should have known his place, should have let the important people handle things their way. He breathed through it the way he'd learned to breathe through everything since Dana died, slow and deep and focused on what was in front of him instead of what was burning behind his eyes. My trees are still alive because I spoke up, he said. My daughter's legacy is still standing because I didn't wait for permission. I know that. You know that. But Whitmore's got friends on the county board, and they're already talking about how your documentation might have delayed response times, how if you'd come forward sooner maybe they could have contained it before it reached his property. That's gaslighting and you know it. I know it. But it's what they're saying. Marcus finished pulling on his jeans and walked to the kitchen. Lily was at the table, already dressed for school, eating cereal and drawing something on a piece of paper with the intense concentration she brought to everything she cared about. She looked up when he entered and held up the drawing. It was a peach tree with roots that went down to the bottom of the page, and next to it was a smaller tree, and between them was a figure with curly hair and a lab coat. That's Dr. Chen, Lily said. She's fixing the dirt. Marcus took the drawing and looked at it for a long moment. His daughter had drawn the roots in orange and brown, the same colors as the flags she'd helped him place in the orchard, the same colors as the soil samples that had sat on their kitchen counter for 6 weeks while he worked double shifts and stayed up late labeling specimen bags. She is, he said. She's fixing the dirt. He taped the drawing to the refrigerator next to the lab report and the soil pH chart and the photo of Dana in her agronomy field gear, standing in front of a research orchard in South Carolina with her arms crossed and her smile wide and her eyes full of the certainty that science could solve anything if you gave it enough time and enough truth. The call from Gary Sutton came 3 days later. Marcus was in the orchard when his phone buzzed, walking row 7 with a clipboard and a moisture meter, checking the trees that had shown the earliest signs of recovery. Dr. Chen's intervention had bought them time, a targeted soil amendment protocol that was labor-intensive and expensive and absolutely necessary if they wanted to save the remaining healthy trees. Marcus had been applying it by hand, tree by tree, working from dawn until the light failed and sometimes past that, with a headlamp and Lily's voice in his ear asking when he was coming inside. The number on the screen was local but unfamiliar. He almost let it go to voicemail. Something made him answer. Mr. Carter. This is Gary Sutton. I run the packing house over in Macon County. You've probably seen our trucks. Marcus had seen them. Everyone in the peach business had seen them. Sutton Packing was the largest distributor in the region, the kind of operation that could make or break a small orchard with a single contract. They supplied grocery chains across the southeast, and their standards were notoriously strict. Most small farmers never got past the initial inspection. I've seen them, Marcus said. What can I do for you, Mr. Sutton? I've been following what's happening up there. The contamination situation. Dr. Chen's report. He paused, and Marcus heard papers shuffling in the background. I've also been looking at your production numbers from the last 5 years. Marcus Carter stood in Gary Sutton's office with the contract on the desk between them and the weight of 5 years pressing down on his shoulders like the Georgia humidity in August. I read Dr. Chen's full report, Sutton said. Not the summary. The whole thing. All 47 pages. She's thorough, Marcus said. She's more than thorough. She's the only reason the state's not quarantining half this county right now. Sutton tapped the contract with one finger. You know how many orchards I've turned down in the last 10 years? I can guess. 23. Some of them had better soil than yours, better irrigation, better everything on paper. You know what they didn't have? Marcus waited. A grower who spent 6 weeks collecting his own soil samples. A grower who walked into a county office with a lab report and a plant pathologist and refused to leave until somebody listened. You know how many black orchard owners I've contracted with in that time? None. You'd be the first. Marcus thought about his father, about the 72 trees that had survived the blight of '89 because his father had stayed up 3 nights straight painting trunks with latex and water. He thought about Claire, standing in this same orchard 7 years ago with her hands on her hips and her eyes scanning the rows like she was already calculating yield projections, telling him that this land was worth more than anyone would ever offer. He thought about Lily, drawing roots that went all the way to the bottom of the page. I'm not looking to be anybody's first, Marcus said. I'm looking to sell peaches. That's exactly why I'm offering you the contract. Premium rate. 3-year guarantee with a 2-year renewal option. You meet the quality standards, and I'll put your fruit in every chain from here to Virginia. Marcus picked up the contract and read it. Not scanning, not skimming. Reading. Every clause, every subclause, every footnote in 6-point type at the bottom of page 4. Sutton waited without speaking, and that silence told Marcus more about the man than anything he'd said so far. A man who let you read in peace was a man who wasn't trying to hide anything in the fine print. The quality standards were strict. Fruit diameter minimums, bricks levels, inspection protocols that would give his county agent a heart attack if he tried to meet them without Dr. Chen's soil amendments. The premium rate was generous, almost too generous, and Marcus looked up from the paper with the question already forming. What's the catch? No catch. Sutton folded his hands on the desk. But there's something you should know. Whitmore called me last week. Before his trees went brown. He wanted me to take a look at his operation, maybe negotiate a contract for next season. Marcus set the contract down. And I told him I'd think about it. Then Dr. Chen's report came out, and I started making calls, and I found out that Whitmore's been using a fertilizer supplier that's been under EPA investigation for illegal dumping since 2019. Sutton's voice went flat. He knew. Maybe not the specifics, but he knew something was wrong with that product, and he kept using it because it was cheap. The information landed like a punch that Marcus had seen coming from a mile away. He'd suspected it for weeks, ever since Dr. Chen had traced the contamination pattern and noticed it stopped dead at his property line. Whitmore's orchard shared a watershed with his, but Whitmore had been applying something that accelerated the spread, something that turned a slow leak into a flood. You got proof? Marcus asked. I've got invoices. Sutton pulled a folder from his desk drawer and slid it across. Dates, quantities, prices that don't match any legitimate supplier in the region. Dr. Chen's already seen them. She's including it in her final report to the state. Marcus opened the folder and looked at the numbers. 23 deliveries over 18 months. A savings of maybe $40,000 compared to what Marcus had been spending on the organic amendments Dr. Chen recommended. $40,000, and it had cost Whitmore his entire orchard plus whatever the EPA was going to fine him when the investigation went public. He won't recover from this, Marcus said. No. Sutton's voice was quiet but not sympathetic. He won't. And I'm not going to pretend I'm sorry about it. A man who poisons his own land to save a few dollars doesn't deserve to farm it. Marcus closed the folder and thought about Dale Whitmore's face at the county meeting, the way he'd looked at Marcus's lab report like it was a personal insult, the way he'd said sometimes you gotta trust what's worked before. Whitmore had been farming that land for 30 years. His father had farmed it before him. And none of that mattered now, because he'd made a choice, and choices had consequences, and the land didn't care about your legacy if you treated it like a disposable asset. I need to make a call, Marcus said. Sutton nodded and gestured at the door. Take your time. Marcus walked outside and stood in the parking lot with his phone pressed to his ear and the afternoon sun baking the asphalt around him. Lily answered on the third ring, her voice bright and curious and full of the particular energy she always had when she'd been waiting for him to call. Did you sign it? Not yet. I wanted to ask you something first. A pause. She was 7 years old, but she'd learned to read his voice the way he'd learned to read soil moisture levels, by paying attention to the things other people missed. What?